the subject, and who are none other than Dr. Ilyas and Dr. Charlie Arching, Dr. Ilyas from UK and Dr. Charlie Arching from Kenya. I would like to welcome both of them for today's webinar. And I also would like to introduce briefly about our speakers for those who have not heard anything about them, especially my students. And Dr. Mohammed Ilyas is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Derby, and his teaching and research range from core and specialist criminology to counterterrorism and security. His current research focuses on developing innovative and culturally specific ways to engage in de-radicalization and counterterrorism in Muslim-majority countries. Dr. Charlie is an executive director and inaugural co-convener of the Africa Network of Critical Security Studies. She is the co-founder of the Decolonial Terrorism Studies Network, where she is currently working with other scholars and stakeholders in the Global South to advocate for local solutions to the terrorism problem by focusing on subaltern voices. She is also the chair of African Political Science Association, Kenya chapter, a platform whose objective is to interrogate the state of politics, governance, economy, and development of African states. She holds a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from University of Otago, New Zealand, which was funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, New Zealand. Her doctoral thesis titled Towards an Indigenous African Approach to Counterterrorism in Kenya was awarded the 2024 Exceptional Doctoral Thesis Award by the university for its outstanding contribution to the counterterrorism space. Dr. Charlie has extensive experience in civil service spanning over 8 years. She has provided policy and technical advice to the Kenya national and county governments on matters of peace and conflict, as well as legislative procedures. Dr. Charlie has published several articles and book chapters in various journals, including the African Review, the Critical Studies on Terrorism, and has been invited by various journals as peer reviewer. So finally, let me share a few information with this note about the speakers. Let me share a few information about today's program, the structure of the program. And the speakers will be given 20 minutes each to present their ideas. And so Dr. Ilyas will present his ideas initially, then followed up by Dr. Charlie. And after two speakers are done with their presentations, then we will open up the floor for Q&A session and comment session. So participants can ask directly, or they can write their questions in the chat box as well. And so they are free to choose either write or the chat box or unmute them and directly ask the question to the speakers. So now it's time to listen to our speakers. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ilyas to share his initial thoughts on decolonizing terrorism research. Dr. Ilyas, the floor is yours.
First of all, hello everybody. Many thanks for inviting me, Dr. Fauzi. I really look forward to talking about something which is very topical, very new when we're speaking about terrorism. Not many people are writing about decolonizing terrorism studies. It's quite a sensitive subject, as I found out from my own experience when I've spoken about this subject to many people, especially practitioners, frontline practitioners and academics who are working in this field in the Global South. So it's a sensitive issue, so a kind of trigger warning that some people do find it quite sensitive.
10 minutes. I'll go to Dr. Mohammed Sulay.
Yeah, it'd be great if all the people attending the webinar can mute themselves.
Yeah. Please unmute yourself, everyone, participants, so we can listen clearly to the speaker. Thank you.
Okay, so I have 20 minutes to go through my slides. I will go through them as quickly as possible because I know in all this, what is important is the Q&A session. So I look forward to your questions about about decolonizing global terrorism studies in Southeast Asia. I'm hearing an echo of myself here.
Yeah, I'm also seeing that. Wait, Nadir, can you fix it?
I think you're also. You also have an echo as well. It just started. It wasn't. In the beginning. So I'm not sure how. Dr. Fauzi, can you speak and see whether there's echo on your side? Because definitely.
Am I echoing? No, my voice is now okay.
Yours is fine now.
So you, Dr. Ilyas, you go ahead. So I think that now it's stopped. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So I will take 20 minutes and go through my slides on the issue on decolonizing global North terrorism studies in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries. It's quite a broad topic, so I will synthesize as much as I can. I've published in this area as well. So there's a lot of articles out there on this area. So I will go through the slides, just bear with me. Okay, so clearly over the last sort of, 2 decades, I guess, there's been real push to decolonize academia. However, there's a caveat to this. This is not new. It's not new. Academics in the global south have been decolonizing academia long before it became popular in my part of the world. Which also begs the question, why has it suddenly, over the last 2 decades become popular, and why was it not popular, in previous decades? That's something that is an important question that I think all academics working on decolonizing need to ask, because it kind of points towards a power structure, an academic power structure, which hopefully we can unpack to some extent here. Now, terrorism scholars and CSOs, particularly in global south countries, have largely refrained from addressing the need to decolonize the discipline and the broader terrorism industry. Yeah. So here, what I'm arguing is that not many academics or CSOs, whether we're talking even my part of the world or global south, are really thinking about decolonizing the terrorism studies, yeah, or the industry, more generally speaking. So in this presentation, I will give a few of the reasons why I think terrorism studies in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries should be decolonized. Of course, this is not exhaustive by any means, and I'm sure for you academics and practitioners who are listening, I'm sure you have your own reasons why it should be, should be decolonized. And it'd be great to hear from you why you think it should be, decolonized. You can, either email me privately or we can discuss here. Okay, so I think before I start, it's important to situate myself, my positionality. Okay, so this presentation is delivered from my perspective of a terrorism studies academic in the global north with heritage rooted in the global south. Yeah, so my work navigates intersecting colonialities that alternatively marginalize privilege me, shaped by factors like race, gender, religion, and geography. So here, what I'm saying is that although I'm sitting in the global north, my roots are from the global south, and the colonialities that shape me are, things like race, gender, religion, and where I am in terms of geography, and these are influenced by Islamophobic, Orientalist imaginaries that are heavily historical and often reinforced through terrorism studies, policies, and global north governments. As we know, since the war in terror, we've had many policies, strategies implemented by many governments, especially in the global north, that have increased Islamophobia in many parts of the world. for myself and my colleagues in the global north, we are often victims of Islamophobia. So I occupy a liminal space, yeah. When it comes to terrorism studies, I'm the subject and the object of my research. Yeah? So I critically examine how colonial legacies shape terrorism studies while advocating for decolonial alternatives. And I hear what's really important to mention here is that not only am I not only do I research into the studies, or not do I research terrorism studies, but I'm also the object of it by myself, purely because of my identity. Yeah, so I become the subject of that as well. Okay, so why global north terrorism studies? Why do I not call terrorism studies, and why do I call it global north terrorism studies? Because we're all familiar. I mean, we all call terrorism studies, but not all of us are familiar with the history of terrorism studies. Yeah, so the history of terrorism studies is steeped in colonialism. I guess I'm speaking to mostly people in the global south. Well, in the context of Malaysia, for example, terms like extremism and terrorism were used during colonial times to describe independence movements. In India, they were used. In Kenya, they were used. Yeah, and more recently, terrorism studies emerges, out of the war on terror. Yeah, that's something. It'd be great if people can mute themselves.
Please, participants, dear participants, unmute yourself. Still, there are a few who haven't yet unmuted. Yeah, so it's disturbing for a speaker to continue.
So terrorism to a global north terrorism is not only it doesn't have a colonial legacy, but it also has a Cold War legacy. Yeah, and more recently, it has a global war on terror legacy. But what we do find in this is that global north terrorism is dominated by actors from the global north. Whether we're talking about academics, NGOs, governments, is dominated by them. I've actually done some research to argue that. So I've done research to argue that most of the knowledge produced in global north terrorism studies is produced by actors from the global north. I published an article a couple of years ago where I analyzed the leading journals, and that clearly told me that that terrorism study in terms of knowledge production is dominated by actors from the global south. Sorry, from the global north. So in this sense, I think it's fit to use the prefix global north, because not only the history, the sort of the early history, but also the modern history of terrorism studies is global north orientated. So therefore, it sounds fit to use the prefix global north. Okay, so my reasoning for what I think global north terrorism studies should be decolonized in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries. Okay. So I'm going to give a couple of reasons here, and because I'm mindful of the time, and then I will go on the last slides. 2 slides will be about the solutions to this. Yeah. Now, like I said in the first couple of moments of the presentation, these are only a few of the reasons. There are many more reasons, and I'm not saying that I have all the reasons why it should be decolonized. I think scholars, academics, frontline practitioners in the global south probably have more experiences of the colonialities that I'm referring to, and perhaps they can add more reasons why it should be decolonized. So, okay, firstly, colonial foundation of global north term studies, rooted in theoretical and methodological framework shaped by colonial legacies. Yeah, perpetuates north-centric and androcentric perspective. This is really important because if we look at terrorism studies or global north terrorism studies more generally, is dominated by men. And the theoretical frameworks that are emerging out of the global north, not from the global south. So core disciplines include counterinsurgency, international relations, critical theory, are often failing to address colonial histories or incorporate decolonial approaches. Yeah. So these theories that we often use that are part of terrorism studies do not incorporate colonial histories or incorporate decolonial approaches. And impact global South context that frameworks marginalize local knowledge systems and suppress indigenous voices. And I think Shirley will talk more about indigenous voices in her presentation. Particularly excludes perspective of women and other marginalized groups, yeah? Reinforces existing inequalities entrenched in power dynamics. And this is really important, the latter one, because that also speaks to the power dynamics in terms of knowledge production in academia. Because the second reason, dominance of state-centric paradigms. Global North tends to prioritize state-centric frameworks, heavily shaping academic and policy discourse in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries. Marginalizes alternative perspectives, focuses a skew towards counterterrorism strategies grounded in Orientalist and culturalist views of Islam. This is quite a controversial point to make. And I would like to hear some sort of views on how, for example, in Global South, academics and CSOs or NGOs are trying to have different perspectives on counterterrorism that are not shaped by Orientalist or culturalist approaches to Islam. Alternative points, particularly those assessing Islamic issues, are sidelined. Yeah. So here I'm saying that issues that are not sort of Islamically orientated are marginalized in the research and policy. So overlooked issues, state perpetuated terrorism, racism, ethno-nationalism, and Islamophobia receive inadequate attention. And of course, I understand this is quite sensitive in, within the Southeast Asian context. And generally speaking, in the Muslim majority context, these are quite sensitive issues. But I think it's important to highlight that how research on counterterrorism and terrorism generally is more Islamically oriented. It doesn't look at other religions. It doesn't look at ethno-nationalism. It doesn't look at racism. And it doesn't look at state terrorism. Yeah. So I think that there's a kind of broader discussion that needs to be had here. Okay. The third reason, marginalization of Southeast Asian scholars. And this is quite important. I think scholars that are publishing and writing on this issue will be familiar with this, and even CSO will be familiar with this. So scholars from Southeast Asian countries are marginalized due to the dominance of global North institutions in academic ranking systems and politics of knowledge production. These systems are largely controlled by scholarly institutions from countries like the United States and, of course, my country, United Kingdom. So soft power. So what was interesting about this is that this produces soft power and knowledge production. So global North countries exercise soft power in shaping global knowledge on political shaping global knowledge on political violence and security issues. Yeah. So this asymmetry privileges global North scholars and institutions while sidelining voices from Southeast Asia and broader global South. So what I'm saying here is that this control of knowledge production gives them a certain soft power to dictate what type of knowledge is produced and the direction of knowledge when it comes to political violence and security. So centralization of global North scholarship. Influential scholars, top-ranked journals and think tanks focusing on political violence and predominantly located in global North countries. So what we're finding here is that the top institutions that work in security, counterterrorism, and the top-ranking journals, even the publishing houses, are all located in the global North. Yeah, historical and structural factors such as intellectual, economic, political imperialism reinforce centrality of global North institutions. And here I would like to sort of direct you to a scholar that I'm sure you're familiar with, is Syed Hussein Alatas. His work on intellectual imperialism is quite important here because he spoke about this many, many years ago, many decades ago, and his work is still relevant today. Okay, this continues the impact in Southeast Asian engagement. Conferences, seminars, and workshops in Southeast Asia constantly center global North scholars and their work. Here, what I mean is that the work of global North scholars is center stage. Yeah. Beyond, so the work of local scholars is not center stage. Instead, scholars from New Zealand, scholars from Australia, Europe, and America, their work is center stage at the expense of local scholars. This imbalance grants global North actors disproportionate influence over theorizing political violence, shaping counterterrorism policy, and influencing global political public opinion. And I think this is really, really important to emphasize that because global North institutions scholars dominate global North terrorism studies, it marginalizes the global South, generally speaking, in terms of the direction, fairization of counterterrorism policies, and of course, knowledge production, and more generally, public opinion. Okay, this is something perhaps really important if you are interested in preserving indigenous knowledges. Okay, English as a dominant academic language. English serves as the de facto lingua franca in academic discourse on political violence. We just have to look at the journals here. Look at the top-ranking journals, look at the top-ranking publications. Even some of the journals in Southeast Asia, they're all producing knowledge in English, yeah? Instead of local language. Of course, there are some, but the top-ranking ones are all producing in English. So, in position of global North epistemologies, English functions not just as a medium of communication, but as a conduit for imposing global North intellectual and cultural traditions. This dominance shapes the perspective of terrorism history scholars in the global South, framing political violence through the global North lens. Okay, now the other point, this is quite important here, is that it's the linguistic hegemony. Long-term risks include the epistemic marginalization or eradication of regional languages that are embedded in intellectual tradition. The lack of native language scholarship threatens indigenous perspective and reduces the diversity of conceptual frameworks for understanding political violence. And here, perhaps I'm appealing to people who are writing in Malay, Bahasa, and other global South languages to write in their own languages and publish in their own languages. Although we may not think this is important now, but of course, this also runs the risk of epistemicide, which we all know has happened historically with other languages and other language systems because of colonialism. Okay, number 5, systemic omission of global South scholars. Terrorism studies scholars from global South countries, including Southeast Asian majority countries, are systematically excluded from the academic discourse. Their work is often omitted from key citations in journal articles, books, and curricula in global North institutions. I think this is a really important point to emphasize, is that a lot of work is published in global South countries about terrorism. The question is how much of it is reflected in the publications of scholars in the global North, NGOs in the global North, and of course, academic institutions. I ask myself this question: how much scholarship do I have in my publications and in my lectures from the global, from the global South? I've tried to address this by inviting guests from the global South to give guest lectures, and I'm often referring to their work in my own publications and my own lectures. But generally speaking, we don't find a lot of this happening in the global North. So marginalization at international forums. I think people who work in CSOs and who attend a lot of conferences will probably understand where I'm coming from with this point. At conferences and workshops, their contributions are frequently disregarded or marginalized. So here I'm talking about the contribution by scholars from the global South. Their work is marginalized. They are often perceived as lacking relevance or advancing theoretical conceptual frameworks, which is a huge problem because in my work and my sort of conversations with scholars and reading scholarship from the global South, they have excellent ideas and they are very theoretical, and I think that their work contributes a lot to the whole history of political violence. So, and Orientalist bias and knowledge hierarchies, and this is really also important. Such omissions reflect Orientalist biases and entrenched in hierarchies that regard global South scholars as intellectually inferior. This is something that I've come across personally in my exchanges and conversations with scholars. Organizers, scholars from global North are often engaging primarily with each other, reinforcing insular, racially, geographically stratified academic work. Here, what I'm saying is that scholars from the global North generally only engage with the work from scholars from the global North, rather than incorporating the work from scholars from the global South. And so, impact on academic equity. These practices perpetuate the marginalization of global South voices, hindering the inclusion and diverse perspectives and furthering entrenching global North dominance in the terrorism industry. And I think I see more of this when I attend conferences, workshops, especially in the Global South, I'd say. I mean, Global South, I take it for granted that, is going to be dominated by scholarship in the global, by scholars in the Global North. But in the Global South, I'm always tending to find that the scholarship is also dominated by Global South, by Global North scholars. Okay, solutions. So the last two slides, solutions. Okay. So my solutions are to decolonize Global North terrorism studies. Yeah. Now I feel that Global North terrorism studies cannot be decolonized in the Global North. It can only be decolonized in the Global South. Now here, I'm not saying that we need to somehow, add a few Global South scholars to sort of Global North terrorism studies. No, I am calling for a quite radical break. Yeah. So my ideas when it comes to decolonization are informed by the Latin School of Decoloniality and the Southeast Asian School of Autonomous Knowledge. And if I'm sure you're aware of the Southeast Asian School of Autonomous Knowledge, that is led by Syed Farid Alatas, who's of course Malaysian but teaches in the University of Singapore. I found his work and his father's work very influential when I'm thinking about decolonizing terrorism studies, and of course the South and of course the Latin American school, which is also influential. So these two schools and these type of thinkers have influenced my thinking around why and how we should decolonize Global North terrorism studies. So my objective is to establish an independent and alternative terrorism studies discipline. So independent of Global North and an alternative to Global North. Yeah. So okay, by what I mean by this, and this is really important to and what I mean by this is that the discipline I'm advocating should not recenter or orbit around Global North terrorism studies. This is really, really important point to make here. It should not orbit around it, and it should not recenter.
Decolonizing terrorism. Decolonizing terrorism. Terrorism research.
Please
Again,
unmute yourself. Yeah.
can I ask participants to mute themselves, please, because it's disrupting the presentation.
Okay, Prof. Dr. Yes.
Okay, so my proposal is not to recenter or orbit around Global North terrorism studies. This is a really, really important point to sort of understand when I'm talking about an alternative and independent approach to terrorism studies. Okay, the key requirements for independence. Okay, this may. So reject narratives rooted in the political, cultural, and economic agendas of Global North countries and allied settler states. And by settler states, if you're not familiar with this, what I'm talking about is talking about New Zealand, US, Canada, Israel, and Australia. These are the settler states that I'm referring to. Avoid perpetuating systems of oppression and control through Global North-centric scholarship. Yeah, detach from the Global North structures, disconnect from political, economic, military, academic, cultural imperialism that imposes intellectual dependency and fosters self-colonization. Overcome the captive mind and intellectuals obedience complex that reinforce reliance of Global North epistemologies. And the number 2 is really important here, because what I'm calling for here is for Global South scholars to develop or to discover their own epistemologies. in terms of development theories and concepts when it comes to political violence. So abandon global north frameworks. Resist the use of global north theories, concepts, and terms like extremism, terrorism, and the theory conveyor that simplify and racialize complex social political issues. These terms are really, so extremism and terrorism are really problematic terms because they are rooted in colonialism. In the case of Malaysia, India, Kenya, even Northern Ireland, they are rooted in colonialism. And often these terms do not carry well when they are transposed into global South contexts. I've actually written about this in my article, in actually two my articles. One's about Indonesia, one's my first article calling for the decolonization of terrorism studies. Using these tools maintains intellectual dependency and reinforces colonial frameworks. So what I'm saying is that if we keep reusing these theories and concepts, all we're doing is maintaining intellectual dependency. Yeah, and all we're doing is reinforcing colonial frameworks. Okay, the path to independent discipline. Develop an alternative terrorism study discipline outside intellectual structures of empire. This means that the discipline I'm encouraging people to develop has to be done outside empire. Empire means, for my context, it means the UK. Of course, we've got different empires outside those empires. So I use decoloniality as a bridge to dismantle colonial frameworks and create theories rooted in the lived experience and epistemology and methodology of Southeast Asian majority countries. Emphasize local worldviews, resist traditions, and community-based knowledge system as the foundation for the new discipline. Yeah, and I'm not saying that these exist now. I'm saying that the work has to be done to develop these, and the work can only be done by scholars and CSOs who are based in the global south. But here, I also like to make a point is that I'm not using decoloniality as a theory in itself. For me, it's a bridge to other epistemologies from the global south, which then they can be used to develop the theories and concepts that we need to develop to, of course, develop a alternative and independent terrorism studies. And let me go, and that's it. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Elias, for your insightful ideas. And so now, actually, lots of information and arguments. I think before we go to Q&A session, we have another presenter, who is Dr. Charlie. And so now the floor is yours, Dr. Charlie. So can you share your insights so we can go for Q&A altogether after the presentations?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zaki, and thank you, Dr. Elias, for that wonderful, fantastic presentation. Just like to mention that I met Dr. Elias in his work before I met him virtually, because literally when I was doing my doctorate, it was really hard getting scholarship on colonizing terrorism. So when I got hold of his work, we got in touch about 2 years ago, and we've been sharing very many ideas since then. We co-founded a network with Dr. Elias. It's called the Colonial Terrorism Studies Network that we founded just this year. And in that network is where you find all the conversations about decolonizing terrorism studies. So if I can just share my my presentation here.
Okay. Dr. Elias, can you, okay, yes, now okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you can see it now. It's taking a bit of time. To load, okay. Can you see it?
Yeah,
Okay,
I can
great.
see it.
Thank
We
you.
can see, yeah. You continue, Dr. Shali.
Yeah, just to run up some ideas from what Dr. Elias has said there, that decolonizing terrorism is not going to be an easy process. That is something that you have to be very, very aware about. Because you see, the nature of terrorism is that terrorism is mainly a very state-centric sort of project. If you look at even the colonial legacies of terrorism, then you discover that the state is always extremely enmeshed in the issues of terrorism, such that the community has no place to even discuss terrorism. The community is often seen as merely an object to be policed, you know. The community is never seen as a subject and or as a genuine contributor to the matters of terrorism. So in Dr. Elias' presentation, I liked when he said that in order to decolonize terrorism, we have to do it in a very radical way. It doesn't matter if we also choose the epistemic road, because we can also choose to decolonize terrorism epistemically, and others can choose the radical path. So whichever path that we pick, we have to realize that it's just going to be combative and radical at the end of the day. So really from his presentation, some of the key things that I've picked from there is that the knowledge on terrorism studies and basically terrorism research does not move from the global south into the global north. It actually moves in a very unidirectional manner, that is from the global north into the global south. So we find these approaches and methods coming into the global south, telling the global south what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to handle terrorism. That knowledge does not move the other way around. So if you just from that statement, you can pick that there's a serious gap that prevails in the way the knowledge of terrorism studies is produced, because it's produced from a very Eurocentric standpoint by scholars that are based in the global north and who pride themselves as experts in the affairs of the global south. We see that all the time in the issues of even funding, where we have scholars coming in from the global north, you know, sitting in committees that have the experts in the global south who ironically don't even see themselves as experts in the first place, because we believe, you know, even here in Africa, even here in Kenya, we believe that when we have scholars coming in from the global north, then they're the ones who know the issues of the global south better. That is something that really needs to change, because the voice of the global south scholars has been marginalized. Sometimes it's not even marginalized, sometimes it's completely silenced. And this scenario, as I've put it, exemplifies the coloniality and epistemic imbalances that are endemic within the field of terrorism studies. So just positioning myself in this discussion today as an African, and mainly as an African woman, you sort of wonder, you know, where is our place within terrorism studies? If you compare the Western sort of an African scholarship on counterterrorism, then you see there's a serious conspicuous marginalization of African literature in the field. Just walk into any library today and sort of pick a book, just check through the shelves on how many African scholars or even scholars from the global south who've written on matters of terrorism, then you'll see a serious mismatch in terms of those numbers, because most of those books are written by scholars from the global north, you know, and also about the staggering numbers of Western experts who are involved in the production of counterterrorism knowledge. These same experts are the same ones who provide policy advice to non-Western governments, and that is despite their ignorance of the local languages and cultures of these societies. I liked what Dr. Elias spoke about decolonizing even the languages. Of course, decolonization is an ongoing process that started way back. In Kenya, we have scholars such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o who wrote about decolonization in the 80s. We've given numerous talks about it. And in his book called De-Colonizing the Mind, Decolonization of the Mind, he speaks about writing in our own indigenous languages, because we have this, I would call it a pandemic really, of scholars from the global south who perpetually write in English. And therefore we even ignore, you know, the people that are coming from our cultures who don't understand the language. Going forward, I'd just like to mention what is this decolonization that we are talking about. We have to realize that decolonization is about delinking from the narrow thinking about colonial relations and opening up the epistemological space for alternative knowledges that go beyond Eurocentrism. You find this decolonization discourse is discussed everywhere. People are talking about decolonizing health, decolonizing education, you know, decolonizing even the university. I heard recently there's even decolonizing the Bible. But for terrorism studies, it becomes really difficult because the state has held this project as a project of their own. That is why you see countries that are obsessed with establishing military bases, and we have even here in Kenya, you have a lot of military bases that have been established by countries such as the US, the UK, and we don't have anybody asking what do the elders think about counterterrorism. Here in Kenya, we have a project that was started in 2016 called the Nyumba Kumi. That is the 10 house project, where you're supposed to know your neighbor so that you gather intelligence and know one another, and even work together with the security sector to sort of mitigate terrorism. But that really failed. It was dead on arrival because the security came in and took it up as their own project and didn't care about what the community thought about it. So mainly decolonization involves reconstructing, that is relinking. We're not just deconstructing and delinking from colonialism. We are also relinking back with our roots, you know, and we have to realize that this is not a destination. It's actually a journey. We are not saying that we go back to a pristine, excellent, fantastic past. We are saying that you know, we have to reconnect and find ourselves. The scholar Chinua Achebe asked, before you have to know where the rain began to beat you, because a man who doesn't know where the rain began to beat him cannot say where he dried his body. We need to ask ourselves, where did the rain begin to beat us as the global south on these matters, that we have to be told what to do on our own very issues, on our security issues. Then we have to be directed. We sit in committees where we are told that, oh yeah, you need to expand your military, and all we can ask when they say jump, all we can say is how high. That is where the mistake comes in. I just want to run you on what decolonization is not, because there are some scholars who've written a book, like there's a scholar named Taiwo Olufemi, has written a very nice book which is called Against Decolonization. And he has dismissed these scholars, especially scholars who write about decolonization, saying that these sort of thinkers, they see decolonization as a catch-all idea to tackle anything with any minor association with the West. To me, that is not how I see decolonization, because we're not trying to replace things. That is called the replacement syndrome, which we are not very interested in. It is not about hostility towards anything with a colonial origin also at the same time. Decolonization also is not a magic wand for exercising colonial hangovers. It is not a journey towards a pristine and authentic past or future, or about creating binaries between Western and indigenous. Because now, if we start doing that as global South scholars, then I think we'll be perpetuating the same hegemony that we're fighting against. Decolonization is how we are looking at it. Is you're saying right now within terrorism studies, there's only one way of doing things. And that one way has already been dictated by scholars by the terrorism industry, by the embedded experts, the think tanks who advise governments. They've already said that this is how you're supposed to handle counterterrorism. They've come up with this universal way of dealing with counterterrorism, where you take concepts, you take approaches that are coming from the global north, and you want to instill them within the global south, without really checking the history and the realities of these countries in the global south. That is why we have the mess that is happening in countries such as Afghanistan. We've seen it in Iraq. We are seeing it everywhere. It's a total disaster. It is not working. That route is not working. So that's why we're saying we need to decolonize this and have approaches that are speaking to our realities as Africans, as Kenyans, as Malaysia, and every country that is within the global south. So what does it mean really to decolonize terrorism research? What it means is that we have to expose the flawed global war on terrorism ideologies and tackle the issue of intellectual imperialism. We have to go back into the past, just like I said, to expose and locate where the rain began to beat us. We have to challenge the global hierarchies and destructive colonial legacy, just like Dr. Elias is spoken very passionately about, and reshape how terrorism is understood and perceived. We have to move away from these Eurocentric discourses that do not speak to our realities, that do not speak to our histories. In the context of former colonies, I've written about decolonizing terrorism approaches, even in New Zealand, because New Zealand is a former colony, and their approaches mainly, of course, come from the global north. But you see, you find that because these approaches are coming from the global north, the main people in New Zealand and the settlers there who are in this country, the Maori, are being discriminated and treated like others, and that is the othering discourse. And it's even here in Kenya where Muslims and Somalis are treated like others. So there's this us versus them narrative that is coming from the global terrorism agenda. So in the context of former colonies, counterterrorism approaches of said countries like New Zealand, these countries that have a colonial legacy, they actually work to legitimize existing colonial practices such as othering. In the context of Africa, I like to say decolonization is about remembering, relaunching, recapturing Africa's lost identity. And you have excellent scholars like Ndlovu Gatsheni from Zimbabwe, who's written very passionately about the decolonization agenda. We have to regenerate Africa. We have to regenerate the global south by historicizing the African experience and resurrecting and reconnecting with the continent's memory, because this has all been wiped away. In Kenya, we have the Mau Mau. The term terrorism in Kenya came about in the 1950s. And the first people who were branded terrorists here in Kenya were the Mau Mau. Those were the freedom fighters. That shows you that we don't have the power of naming, even as Africans, because today we wake up and find something has been named, but it has not been named by an African. It has been named from somebody emanating from outside the continent. But when we have the same colonial government killing freedom fighters, then we don't call that terrorism. Then we give it another name. And you've seen even in countries like South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was even branded terrorist at one point. It shows you that we really do not have monopoly in these matters. I'll just show you this figure by a scholar named Annie Marimba, who's brought this out really clearly in this drawing, where they speak about mind control, called it European utamawazo. You see how knowledge moves, and you see how basically this issue of the regime of truth, where does the global south come in? Because the global south really is a place where knowledge comes in from the north. You're told what to do. Your history is denied. You are told how to think. You're told this is the way to go. And for you, you're supposed to really surrender your power, and sit down and be told, yeah, we need to increase the military. We need to securitize all these projects. And there's nothing you can do about it. Just before I finish, I'd really like to this is a challenge to all of us. I call the slide the curse of the comprador. And who is the comprador? The comprador class is a very dangerous class that we have in the global south. This particular class are the sort of people who continue bidding for Western ideas in third world countries. These are people who are trained to embrace Western ideas. Though they're from the global south, their ideas mimic Western ideas and dismiss their own ideas as inferior. And this class poses significant obstacles to the advancement of alternative knowledges because their thinking is based on Western categories and thoughts. They possess what Dr. Elias also has mentioned there. They possess the captive mind, that is intellectual subjugation. That is a lazy mind that doesn't want to think, but wants to regurgitate, continually regurgitate what they've been told to do. So for years, these are the sort of class that has advanced the epistemicide undertaken by Eurocentric consciousness and has led to internalized inferiority. In my thesis, I spoke a lot about African inferiority, whereby we do not believe in our own ideas, that we see everything that is coming in from the West as great, and our own ideas as inferior, because we've been told indigenous methods are not scientific enough, they're not rational. And what do we say to that? We sit back and we perpetuate the same epistemicide, which basically epistemicide is the destruction and death of alternative knowledges in the name of modern science. So this sort of class also perpetuates androcentrism, just like Dr. Elias spoke about. That is seeing terrorism, from the masculine point of view. And even now in Terrorism Matters, really, we ask ourselves how many experts sitting in terrorism committees in our own governments are even women, These are the same ideas that are, emanating, very colonial ideas that are busy being perpetrated, and we're just continuing these colonial continuities that come along with that. So just like Dr. Elias spoke about very well in his slides about, how do we deal with all this? Because we've realized really the geopolitics of knowledge is not with us. It is coming, it is in the global north. What do we do about that? He spoke about a radical break, which I completely agree with. We need to sort of assert ourselves and come up with alternative knowledges. For my thesis, I came up with an original African framework, which is called the Usalama Utu counterterrorism framework, which is really an indigenous framework of how to handle counterterrorism in the global south. So these are the sort of ideas that we need to start coming up with, even in Malaysia. What sort of ideas, what sort of approaches are context specific for the Malaysian, for Malaysia itself? What is the one that is specific for India, for Indonesia, for Sri Lanka? What are these methods? We need to have a shift from the dominant Western epistemology, and that includes methodology as well. We are not just speaking about approaches, even the methods we use. Some of these methods are extremely Western. Don't we have our own methods? In Africa, we have concepts like Ubuntu. Ubuntu is also a methodology, but we rarely have it being used by our own scholars. So we must challenge this hegemonic production of knowledge in counterterrorism by deconstructing terrorism as a product of coloniality and encourage pluriversality of alternative knowledges in how terrorism is understood and dealt with. So basically the last slide, this one is just a quote from Frantz Fanon, who's one of the scholars who really fought and advocated for decoloniality way back before most of us were born. So really for many among us, the Eurocentric model is the most inspiring. Let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with me in this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Shali, for your wonderful presentation. And so now it's time for question and answer and comment session or any observations and critical ideas. So now I open up the floor. So anyone, if anyone wants to ask, so Munira Mustafa, she has just so unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sorry about mess. Hi.
Okay.
Sorry about the mess. Oh dear, sorry, forget the camera. Right. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. I love every second of it, and I'll try to keep my comments short. Dr. Elias, I really appreciate your observations about the problems that's been, permeating through our space. I come from a mix of academic and practitioner background, and Dr. Shirley, oh my God, everything you said was basic. I literally had it noted down in my notes before you said it. The problem of the comprador class permeating through the space, and that's extremely frustrating. So what? Sorry.
So go ahead, Munira.
Okay, I think there's an echo, and because it's been a frustrating endeavor coming across all these very Eurocentric ideas about terrorism, about the way it's being structured and formulated and theorized. And on top of that, sorry, I think someone's got their their device on mute. It's very distracting.
Yeah, please unmute the participants. Dear participants, please unmute yourself so you can, yeah.
Right. So as I was saying, I think the problem is that, and I really, really hate the current conceptualization or radicalization, because I think it's highly problematic. The whole conveyor belt nonsense, the staircase of terrorism nonsense, it doesn't work like that in real life. So it's a mix of comment and question for myself is that because we, even in Malaysia ourselves, we have these existing barriers into addressing the problem meaningfully without making it into a state instrument to be suppressive. And a lot of it is borrowed from the whole concept of GWOT itself. But there's what I was trying to think is that I think borrowing Martha Crenshaw's work itself, which the one thing that I paid attention to the most is that I think people are diluting the fact that terrorism itself is a tool. It's not an ideology. It's not an idea whatsoever. It's just a tool. It's an instrument of warfare. And I think the concept of the whole power dynamics of small against big, because why do people use terrorism? Because they don't have access to conventional warfare, right? When they go up against a state apparatus that's a regime that's authoritarian or cruel. And I think that my burning question that I have in my mind is that, is there any space, any room to rehabilitate the concept and terminology of terrorism itself, so that it's more understood, not as an idea, but more as a tool, an instrument, as the way that Martha Crenshaw has self-described, because it is an instrumentation. So I would love to know what your thoughts about this.
Yeah. Dr. Elias and Dr. Shali, so any one of you can respond to this question.
Shirley, do you want to respond first?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Munira, for your very insightful comments there. I just to answer your question, first of all, I think as scholars coming from the global south, rehabilitating terrorism itself, I think this is one of the projects that decolonization is all about. Remember, the word terrorism itself is very colonial roots. Going back to the 1700s, in 1796, the term terrorism was actually used during the French Revolution, to quell dissent. It has been used all over in the global south, as a tool, really, to entrench Western interests within the global south. So the question that, and the challenge really for the global south right here is, how do we define terrorism based on our terms? And I've seen this obsession with scholars running around, and I'm so happy terrorism really doesn't it has had there's this definitional quagmire going on, because sometimes as scholars we are obsessed with these definitions that are coming from, you know, from the UN, from all these bodies that ask ourselves, why don't you define terrorism the way we want to define it? We've been told that, this is how we, you know, we are supposed to define it, but does it fit? You've seen that has failed in Africa, where terrorism was being used to, you know, to say that freedom fighters are actually terrorists. And the African Union actually changed that definition because it was not serving the interests of the Africans. So I believe there is space through decolonization to actually define to define this the way we want to define it. I know, Dr. Elias, you'd say that we need to abandon some of these concepts completely. And that is also great, you know, because these concepts have colonial, have this colonial hangover attached to them. Why don't we come up and say, now this is what we think this term should be. This is the African version. And I've even spoken about it in my own thesis, that terrorism itself, even in Swahili, it's something that we are forcing, you know. It is not a term that came from us. So we are trying to force it and pick this, you know, force it into a language that, the Swahili language, yet we don't even know what exactly it stands for, you know, based on our own reality. So I hope I've answered your question, Dr. Elias.
Yeah, great, Munira. Many thanks for the questions and your comment. Firstly, I think it's really, really important that scholars and CSOs, representatives in the Global South start reflecting on some of their practices, some of their theories and conceptualizations that they use in their everyday knowledge production and work. I spend a lot of time living in Southeast Asia, so I'm quite familiar with the work and the practices of CSOs within the region and how they often regurgitate and rehearse global north concepts like extremism, terrorism, conveyor belt theories, and so on. And it's a problem that needs to be addressed in the global south by global south academics. So for me, yes, we absolutely need to abandon concepts like extremism, terrorism, because like Dr. Shirley said, they have colonial legacies. What often goes amiss is that when we're using these concepts, we think that they don't have baggage. They absolutely have baggage, and that baggage is carried on into the new context. For example, extremism, as an example, it emerges out of a colonial, you know, experience where, like Dr. Shirley says, with the same thing with terrorism, it was used to discredit people who oppose colonialism. The Maori, for example, in India, in Malaysia, and so on. So in that sense, we need to absolutely abandon it. But as a replacement, I think this is not for me to come up with a replacement. This is for scholars in the global south to think of alternatives to concepts like terrorism and extremism. And firstly, also ask the question: are these terms useful? Are these theories useful? By using this, are we not just reinforcing colonialities into everyday practices when it comes to counterterrorism practices? So I think that's the question that that practitioners and academics in the global south need to ask about, you know, about the work themselves, rather than someone like me from the global north saying what should happen, what shouldn't happen. I mean, that's really important. What's also important to mention is the compradors. The compradors are really interesting, and they exist everywhere. The work of Farid Alatas, the work of Dabashi, and so on, and numerous other scholars have spoken about this, that this class exists within the global north, but it also exists in the global south. and it operates in a slightly different way to the global north as it does in the global south. I've actually written about this, and the article should be published very, very soon when I actually speak about this. But again, this is something, again, that scholars from the global south and CSOs from the global south need to reflect on their own practices and ask themselves, are they actually engaged in comprador stuff? Sometimes they engage in it without actually realizing. But also, I would like to caveat this comment by saying that the politics, or rather the economics politics in the global south are different to the global north. And sometimes comprador cannot be avoided, because often it means putting food on the table. And that is something which is really important to factor in when we are, of course, thinking about issues around decolonization of terrorism studies.
Thank you, Dr. Elias. Dr. Muir, you have raised your hand to ask a question. So, yeah, Dr. Muir, go ahead. Go ahead. Dr. Muir, you are muted, I think. So, you are still muted. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Shirley, Dr. Elias, thank you for your time and the presentation. Amazing things. I'm Dr. Mio. I'm the coordinator of the Policy and Area Studies Research Unit as well. I'm hearing the Mamas, I'm hearing the coloniality, decolonization. My own thesis initially wasn't really on terrorism studies per se. It was parallel, I would say, because my work was on counterinsurgency and counterinsurgency narratives, particularly supposed lessons that we have learned from the Malayan emergency. Yeah, so it was challenging this sort of huge narrative over, and again, this was coming at a time when Iraq and Afghanistan was sort of like still somewhat in motion, although sort of ending, right? My question, and I'm quite sort of taken by the whole thing. Can you tell me more about this network that you were mentioning earlier, the decolonial terrorism network or something or other? Because I heard, do you mind? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Alif. Yes, I mentioned about the Colonial Terrorism Studies Network that myself, Dr. Elias, and Dr. Sam Owanda have founded. It's very, very new, actually, because it just started around August this year when we came together, and there are other scholars that are also part of this network. Mainly, it's scholars who believe in the decolonization idea of decolonizing terrorism studies. So basically what we do is that, we're planning on having a website where we showcase all of these ideas. We promote the work of scholars who are writing in this area, because as Dr. Elias had mentioned before, you find that scholars who are writing on terrorism and even perspectives from the global south are not being taken seriously. We're sort of a marginalized voice, we're sort of drowning in all the scholarship that is coming from the global north. So what we want to do with this network is highlight and give it visibility so that the people in the global south can understand that this project is very important to the people of the global south, so that we define our own and chart our own path in how we want terrorism issues to be handled in the global south. So it's a global south network that is welcome to scholars from all over the world, practitioners from all over the world, people within the NGOs, the civil society are also welcome, and even the community, because we're embracing all these people. Especially people within the community who are the custodians of counterterrorism knowledge. These are the people who have the indigenous knowledge that we need. So I think in the coming days, we sort of will be promoting the work more. I'll get in touch with Dr. Zaki for that, so that he can also share these ideas with you. But in the meantime, there's also another network known as the African Network of Critical Security Scholars. And I'm happy that Dr. Zaki here is one of our members as well. That is a network that is already out there. You can check out the website. It's annex.net. I will just write it here on the chat so that you can be part of it. Because it's called African Network, it doesn't mean that it's a network exclusively for Africans, but it's a network that is for scholars that are passionate about having critical discourse within security studies. Because you see, security studies, just like terrorism studies, these are discourses that are very much controlled by the global north and by, state ideas and the global north ideas. So we are encouraging critical ways of understanding security within this network. So if you go to the website there, I've just shared it right now. That is the website, annex.net. You can fill in the membership form, and we'll be happy to have very many collaborations and even conferences together. One of our partners in that network is actually this network of Decolonial Terrorism Studies Network. Thank you. Dr. Elias, I don't know if you want to add something.
Okay, yes, I think it's really, really important that we have set up this network sort of on decolonial terrorism studies. I think it's really, really important. And of course, do the network or the African Network for Security Studies. I think they're both important because what they do is they give voice to the Global South, academic and scholars in the Global South, who, from my experience from attending many workshops in Malaysia, Indonesia, and certainly Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. By the way, I used to live in Singapore for about 9 years, so I'm quite well. I'm sort of aware of the situation over there. So my comments are sort of informed by that experience. Mostly the voices are omitted. They're not present. The Global South scholars' voices are not there, and they need to be heard. They need to be valued, and they need to be forwarded as independent alternative voices to the the sort of dominance of global north voices. So I think both networks are really important, and the more people we can get on board, the better it will be. The more workshops we have face-to-face, conferences face-to-face, the more funding we can get for research projects, the better it will be. Because ultimately what we're engaged in is social justice. That's the whole point. We're engaged in social justice. We're engaged in trying to find better solutions to address political issues, social issues, issues around political violence, issues around ethnic cleansing, issues, all sorts of issues that are considered social justice we're interested in. So our appeal is broad, and I would like to take this opportunity to encourage everybody and to join the both networks. And I would like to ask everybody who's here to tell their friends, to ask them to tell their friends to join both networks. The more people who have, the better it will be. Because I think this is a movement. It's quite small at the moment, but I'm convinced that it will be a big movement very, very soon. So I encourage everybody to join.
Thank you, Dr. Elias. I think Jennifer is has raised his hand. Yeah, so please, Jennifer, go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, I actually wrote it in the chat, but I just wanted to also ask, how do you promote your theories and concepts in the midst of living in countries with hostile governments, specifically in the global South, who find their own Western promoted counterterrorism techniques superior to any community knowledge? I can speak from the country that I'm in right now. How do you get your methods and approaches to be utilized within the security sector? And how do you continue that influence? I realize that's in part by joining your networks that you've just mentioned. So thank you for that. But if there are any other thoughts around this question, thank you.
Dr. Elias, Dr. Shadi.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for your question. Look, you see, just like we've said here, this is a monumental task. It's not very easy to come up with these approaches and sort of try to convince even governments, especially governments in the global South, that are very much, hostage to these global North ideas. So sort of what we try to do is, like, publications is one of the key things. When you publish in this area, publication is one of the ways you challenge these sort of traditional methods. When you have your work out there and people read and they resonate with your work, you sort of try, it's like a journey, a journey of 1,000 steps, they say, actually begins with just a single one. It's not going to be easy. For example, having a network such as ANNEX or the Decolonial Terrorism Studies Network. These are not traditional networks out there that you find that are speaking the same things and regurgitating the same things. So just to give an example, like the network of the African Network on Critical Security Scholars, when it came out there, we were actually very surprised to see that there were so many people who came into the network and said that, wow, this is so beautiful, because these ideas are actually not out there. You know, we want to be part of this conversation. We want security to be looked at from the standpoint of the people from the global south. We want security to be done and thought about in our own ways, to sort of embrace ideas that are coming from us, because we are not seen as knowledge producers. We are often seen, especially for Africans, simply as knowledge consumers. So what we are challenging is having ourselves branded as knowledge producers as well. We sit in committees. For example, I've had the privilege of working with the National Steering Committee on peace building here in Kenya, and even speaking to the IGAD, Peace and Security Division, on these matters. And I think you'll be very surprised that governments sometimes, even in Africa, they are not really opposed to some of these ideas. Sometimes I think it's a lack of exposure even to some of these ideas. Compounded with that, and there's a question I also saw about that, the money aspect. And I tackled that also in the thesis. Sometimes these are indigenous ideas, sometimes don't attract money, because we know where the money is going to. The funders sort of say this is the agenda, you know, and if they say this is the agenda, then you have to see how to force your you know, to sort of come up with a narrative so that you can get some funding out of that. Dr. Elias will tell you how it's a bit hard to get funding, even in decoloniality and these matters. But I feel like there are still people who are embracing this. Even in Kenya, we have Kenya Peace Building Architecture that we came up with last year when I was in the National Steering Committee. And I was very surprised to actually see that one of the recommendations that came out of that peace building architecture was that we need to decolonize the issues of security. We need to decolonize the issues of counterterrorism. And that was really such a huge, huge moment, because that is not something that you would think that the government is really going to consider. But we just need to look at the numbers. It is not working. These methods that are coming in from the north, they are not working in Africa. We need methods that bring people together, not methods that cause terror and fear and sort of push people away and sort of say the Muslims here or the Somalis here are the terrorists. So when the government sees that these methods and these ideas will actually bring unity and actually work in the country, then they will embrace it. Because for me, it is just a matter of showing them that it can work. And that is the challenge for us, to show them that it can work. And I think we've started doing that well.
Thank you, Dr. Shali. I have a final question, and with that, I would like to wrap up this session since we are running out of time. And I would like to ask both Dr. Ilyas and Dr. Shali to reflect on, from academic terrorism studies, how does it fit with the colonial process, or decolonizing terrorism research is somewhat different from critical terrorism studies? So can both of you reflect on what is critical terrorism studies and what is actually where decolonization happens within that discussion?
Dr. Elias?
Yeah. Okay. So first, if it's okay, can I respond to Jennifer's question? I think that's really important. First, Jennifer, if you can tell me, where are you located in? Because you said you're located in the country.
I'm in the Philippines.
In the Philippines. Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. Okay. So basically, quickly, I mean, I don't want to rehash what Shirley has said, but yeah, that's really, really important. But also what we have to think about is our own practices in terms of scholars and CSOs. How do we engage with government? Often what I've found in my experience when I've spoken to security officials in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries, they're not aware of these new knowledges. they're not aware of these new ideas, because often they are trained by scholars and by militaries from the global north, and I'm sure you'll know the relationship between the Philippines and the US and so on, in terms of military training, in terms of knowledge training, and so on. So they're not often aware of these alternative ideas, and that's purely because the knowledge production on terrorism studies is controlled by the global north, and of course, governments are also connected to this. So my experience, I've found that actually it's important to connect with security services, speak to them, develop networks with them, and actually, and speak to them about alternative ways to think about security, and highlight the problems and issues that are engendered by global north terrorism strategies and policies in the global south, and how that actually doesn't resolve conflicts. It actually, in many ways, perpetuates the conflicts, and so increases injustices among indigenous people and other minority communities. So I think often they're not aware of these different ideas. And our job from a decolonial perspective, anybody who's interested in social justice, is to engage with government, engage with security services, and actually discuss these kind of ideas with them, because like Shirley said, they're not aware of this at all. It is quite new to them. But in terms of funding, that's really, really important. And this is where I think I would ask academics and CSOs from the global side to actually reflect on exactly who is funding their research, who is funding their policies, where are they getting the money from to actually do the work that they're doing. And then also ask themselves, how much control do they have over the production of knowledge, and in terms of what is published, what is not published, and so on. So I think there's a lot of questions that academics and CSOs can ask themselves in terms of their own sort of work, and who's funding them, and why they're getting funding from certain organizations and certain embassies and so on. These are really important questions. If we're thinking of decolonization, these are really important reflective questions to ask, by global south scholars and CSOs. So I think these are two really important things. But in terms of what Dr. Fawzi is asking in terms of decolonization and critical terrorism study is critical, but it's operating within a global north epistemological framework. Decolonization, from my perspective, is going to be developed and based on epistemologies from the global south. Yeah. So here, I'm encouraging scholars from the global south, from indigenous traditions, Islamic traditions, so on, to revert to their own epistemologies, develop them, or recover them, or discover them, and build their work based upon them. So I am not saying that there should not be a critical terrorism studies. Here I'm not saying that there should not be a global north terrorism studies at all. Here I'm advocating sort of plurality, saying that there should be an alternative that is based on global south epistemologies. And in the case, if you look at Southeast Asia, we've got the two biggest Muslim populous countries. And are we saying that both countries collectively together, and scholars collectively together from both countries, cannot produce their own alternative independent terrorism studies? Yeah. So I'm encouraging an independent and alternative terrorism studies, without saying we need to somehow reject global north terrorism studies or critical terrorism. I'm saying that's fine. They all can exist side by side, all offering different perspectives, because different countries need different solutions. Yeah. So and that's what I'm advocating here.
Thank you, Dr. Ilyas. So with that question, I think we have to wrap up today's wonderful and insightful webinar. And so thank you all for joining us today for this insightful webinar. And before we wrap up, I want to express my deepest gratitude to our main speakers, Dr. Ilyas and Dr. Charlie, who shared with us some insightful observations and which can guide us in our research and conversations in future on decolonizing terrorism research. Also, a big thank you for our incredible audience for their engagement and thoughtful questions. And in addition, I also like to thank the head of Policy and Area Studies Research Unit, Dr. Miol Alif, and his team for this arrangement. And in addition to that, also, I would like to remind that we have another webinar coming up on the 20th of December next month in the title Global War on Terror and the Rise of Islamophobia, the Malaysian Perspective. The speaker of the event will be Assistant Professor Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi from Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization at International Islamic University of Malaysia. So I invite all the participants for today's webinar also to join in that event as well and share their critical observations and perspectives. With that information, I conclude this webinar. So I again thank you, the speakers, Dr. Shali and Dr. Ilyas, and also I invite them to visit Malaysia. And Dr. Ilyas, I think hopefully will be here in a couple of days, I think. And Dr. Shali also. And also I encourage other scholars, academics to join their network, African Network of Critical Security Studies, and also other Decolonizing Terrorism Studies Network. So I think I consider that it could be a good platform to share our observations and ideas. Dr. Ilyas, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. Yes, you're right. I will be in Southeast Asia in December and January. And I think if it's okay with everybody there, I think I would like to encourage Dr. Zaki and his colleagues in his department and ISTAC on trying to organize a workshop where we can have a face-to-face workshop where we can discuss decolonization of terrorism studies. I think that'd be better and a step towards having more sort of, solid relationships between myself and Shirley and, of course, scholars from Indonesia and Malaysia.
Thank you, Dr. Ilyas. So we will look forward to you, and I will talk to my colleagues about the possibility of having a workshop. And thank you all for joining us today. And Dr. Ilyas and Shali, I'll get back to you, inshallah, hopefully, about the feedback and the questions. So all the participants can even send their personal observations, questions in there through the email. So get in touch with the speakers and get their ideas and other insights. So thank you very much. So I conclude this with the notes, with the dua. Subhanallah,